on it.
Your portfolio.
Yeah, I'm doing a presentation.
You know, like you've been to an interview at Central St Martin's.
Yeah, whenever I go to West London. You're like good, yes. You've been traveling, no?
There's no escape. It was quite impressive, though.
Yeah, no, that one. I'm here all day.
Yes. Well, I get the train back tonight at 6. So yeah, I didn't know at all. It was a surprise. It's quite hard in a way.
Yeah, I saw that.
It's not good timing.
No. But I
just can't say.
For
yeah,
the nation.
exactly. So we have to take this thing mainstream. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what
it's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
It just becomes a crazy project in Middlesbrough.
I thought this makes so much sense. I was feeling sorry for myself.
No, maybe. In fact, I have 2 parks.
Oh.
Mid-February.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's happening with you? I don't have like a now.
Sit on the lift.
Yes. Yeah. No one's allowed to have a vision.
Yeah, no, I would think so. Yeah. There's enough vision.
I've just been writing the
There's
thing.
enough vision for the next 2 years.
Yeah, just carry on.
Yeah.
And the Council University, the Arts, everybody wants it to carry on doing the same, so there's no point in.
Yeah, I mean, that's why
they're worried about changing it, that's their big worry.
Because then it just becomes a...
So actually, most same as usual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they know what they're doing. Yeah, no, exactly. Just carry on, it's fine.
Yeah, I think pretty important the time is borderline.
Yeah, one real realization of it. Quite hard. Even doing my PowerPoint task, I was thinking, even just doing my presentation for the day and looking at the pictures and everything we've done. But it's brilliant. It's done so much. And I've just got the branding right, and now I'm bloody leaving. It's so annoying. Yeah, but I think that's good. I mean, normally I would say, and that's the trouble, because I've always been quite against the idea of these directors that hop around from place to place. And I wouldn't have. Yeah, but that's it's like what it won't come up again. So, and it won't come up again. This thing.
Okay, let's be happy today. My portfolio.
Cooperation project that has been prepared for many weeks and months already. So it's together with the Frieze project, Swiss Culture and Conflict, with the Artas Foundation, sponsored by the Arts Council in England, and also we're supported by the Swiss Cultural Institute. So a wonderful lineup of partners. But what I would especially like to emphasize for this program that was really on a human level from the very beginning that I felt was a very special cooperation with everybody who we met. For us, for the Goethe Institute, it's just a very timely topic. We're very happy about the lineup of speakers. And essentially, I guess it's also the very core, it touches the very core of what we do in our work around all the institutes know it's an ongoing cooperation. Last year we had already a symposium working across continents. This year the topic is working across divides. And there will be a next one, but I will leave this to Raphael to announce. I won't give it away. I do want to thank Marcel Bloyer and Michaela Krimen for the fruitful exchange. It was literally from my very first day here at the Goethe Institute that this very special chemistry between the two was mentioned to me, so I'm very curious what we did today. Also, thank you to Raphael, to Kezia, and to Louis from Frieze Symposium for the good cooperation, and of course for all your hard work and dedication. And of course also thank you to my team, especially Mario and Siri. And thank you to all the speakers who are here. We're very honored to have you here with us today. And just very briefly, 3 organizational matters. For the very short coffee breaks, it might be a bit rush for you to head all the way down to Kensington, South Kensington Station. So there is a coffee shop across the park here. Oh, it's a bit of an, it's actually a shop, but you can get coffee there. So. And for lunch, we recommend places down near the South Kensington Station if you want to grab some. And also for you to know, we are on YouTube and Facebook Live, so please do share with your friends that you're here. And please tweet if you can. If you need internet, just get in touch with one of us and we'll be happy to give you the code. So enjoy the symposium today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, and I'll do thanks a little bit later as well. Yes, indeed, last year we programmed a symposium here to consider the realities of Western artists and curators working on other continents, the questions, the challenges, and the excitements of doing that, and equally of bringing work from a very different context here, say from Burkina Faso or from Kabul, to a Western white cube. But today we focus more on people and issues on our own doorsteps, or at least not far from them. The stakes are high. Hannah Arendt believed that a society in which individuals are disconnected from each other is most vulnerable to totalitarian leaders. I think we probably all agree that we find ourselves in a world marked by some pretty aggressive, bellicose, divisive and scary politics and politicians. We have a media that tolerates the toxic language of people like Katie Hopkins here, who called asylum seekers cockroaches, clearly with little knowledge of what happened in Rwanda, for instance. And the press regulator accepted this simply as, and I quote, bad taste. A YouGov survey earlier this year reported that only 28% believe migration from the Arab world has been beneficial to the UK, 28%. And 64% believe that Arabs have failed to integrate, thus also putting the blame squarely on a supposedly homogenous group called Arabs, as well as us being homogenous. We have the effects of neoliberalism, or as Nabil Ahmed frames it, the dark twinning of capitalism and colonialism. This week we're commemorating the much derided Balfour Declaration, which is nevertheless also celebrated against the backdrop of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine. Indeed, border drawing has of course been a particular speciality of UK administrations, and these go on causing untold misery. And despite some very great positive steps, of course, that have been made, we are nevertheless neck deep in the most extraordinary and shameful inequalities, evidenced in relation to ethnicity, class, colour, age, gender, and of course we have the divides across religious beliefs and political allegiances. So we have a big subject today. But against some significant odds, against these significant odds, we acknowledge the multiplicity of work that has taken and is taking place. One of the people who was finally unable to join us today is Bonaventure Subejin and Viken, who set up Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, an art space, much like yours, Alistair, food and drink hangout that turns hospitality into a way of undermining a north-south dichotomy within the art world. And respect to the Savvy team and to so many individuals and collectives, from the wisdom of Stuart Hall to the activities of the showroom, from the community arts projects of the 80s here to Charles Esch and the Van Abbey Museum, from Theaster Gates to Rick to Ravanija. We also acknowledge the many texts that have been written about this, about these subjects in different ways and the issues of today's symposium, including actually the Goethe Institute's own recent inquiry into the civic role of arts organisations. We're excited today, first of all, to have people in the audience and to welcome you with much experience to contribute. Bernadette Buckley, who's spotted from Goldsmiths, Juan Delgado, who's an artist, and also Isabel Lima Gresham. I'm not quite sure where you are, but whose work I saw the week before last and was so impressed by. And on the platform, very shortly, we will welcome artists, curators and writers who share the interest in the constructive agency of art, who have and are working to build bridges and to effect change, people who are determined to upset the status quo, and who are making the effort to ensure art is more inclusive, who through different means address urgent issues and continually question and investigate and irritate. So this is an opportunity to hear about a diversity of projects and also to bring a raft of perhaps age-old questions for speakers and audience alike, but to ponder afresh, now with some urgency. Questions about intent, agency, funding, I think we should talk about, representation, participation, power, questions about how to sustain a project, authorship and participation, hospitality, and not least education and incremental learning. Is there a middle ground on which to operate, and if not, how to create it? So before handing over to Marcel, and it's true, I can't think of anyone wiser or with more knowledge or funnier or who brings me so much chocolate from Switzerland to work with. Absolute pleasure. And to Raphael again, who's an absolute joy to work with, to the Goethe Institute for this opportunity, and to Frieze, and especially for people who have been closely involved. To you, Katrin, to Mario at the back, to the Goethe, and to Cassia and Lewis, who are both here. Thank you. You're a total pleasure to work with.
Yes, welcome also from my side, and thank you, of course, to everyone. I will not repeat all the names, but I will hug you later. And Catherine was mentioning the chemistry, and you were mentioning the audience's experiences, and I really hope that you can also share them. Like, I hope that we can have some kind of interactive atmosphere where you can ask questions or do comments whenever you feel like. And to set this tone, I will give a very subjective account that leads to the questions that I'm interested in for this morning, which have to do with a job I have in Salzburg. Salzburg is this Austrian city where Mozart is born. It's like a city close to the border, next to the border actually, to Germany. And when I started to work there in 2015, there were really every day thousands of migrants arriving who came through the Balkans and who were stopped at this border. For the people in Salzburg, and especially for the officials, it was most of all a logistic problem, what to do with all these people. And they really didn't handle it well. Like in many other places in Central and Eastern Europe, it was quite a chaotic and even catastrophic situation. And I mean, it was an amazing, or let's say, intense atmosphere to start to know this city. And I really felt like there's one part in the society, in civil society, who right away started to help caring for all these migrants. They were really trapped behind fences, waiting for permission to either go further to Scandinavia or Germany or to settle in Austria. There was another group in society who gave their best to ignore them, their presence, like they pretended they were not there, even if it was very visible in the city. And a third group that was increasing also daily, I think, who were very hostile to the presence of these trapped migrants. So it was a difficult situation, and many artists who are associated with the institute where I work in Salzburg started to engage or work with these temporary communities that were built behind these fences. And I was also, not as an organizer, but let's say as an observer or participant involved in some of these projects. Now, many people who work in such situations of social, acuteness or precariousness see art as an instrument that you can use to change something. Maybe art is used to achieve relief for people, to achieve distraction or even therapeutic effects. And I find myself always being a bit skeptical in regard to this understanding of art as an instrument, because it also implies the idea of a manipulation of those you address. You want to achieve something with them. So in contrast, I try to see art maybe more as a space of negotiation and imagination. A process that is kind of open, and a process that I see for itself to be the artwork. And this negotiation and imagination often already starts before a project really is set to work. I mean, to organize an art project in a diverse social situation, like behind these fences in Salzburg, where there's the migrant communities with all the people from Salzburg around, to organize an art project in such a context unavoidably brings forward the question of what is art anyway? I mean, my understanding, for instance, differs a lot from the understanding of art from the migrants who went through the Balkans and were trapped in Salzburg. And when these different understandings of art are put into discussion, the process of negotiation and imagination starts. And in many contexts, I think this is already a lot if such a process works. At the same time, and this is what I really feel there is a necessity for discussion, at the same time, these negotiations are always underlined by power structures. First of all, as a member of an extremely privileged country like Switzerland, I always come into the position of a symbolic authority, even if I don't want to. And even if I give my best at sharing agency or at acting sensitively and addressing everyone as equals, I remain the one with the money, with the passport that allows me to travel freely in the world, and the one who has had access or who has access to internationally connected education that is really recognized in the world. Secondly, also in a community behind these fences in Salzburg, where the migrants are trapped, there are tensions and hierarchies that we cannot ignore, I guess. I mean, in these temporary communities, especially if they're multi-ethnical, maybe there are members who have names who sound like enemy names of others who are also in these zones. For what I know, in such situations, there's often a majority who has more power and also more means to express what they need, what they want, how to organize things. So there's also a kind of division within these temporary communities. Nevertheless, in my experience, it is possible to create moments of an inclusive we across all these divides. However, most of the time, I feel that we need to find ways to working with these divides. Because to ignore them or to pretend that they don't exist can be rather dangerous. We risk to unconsciously or silently reproduce them. So there's some questions that result from these reflections. I think the most important one is, how can we work with divisions without reinforcing them? What actions and effects can come out of working with divisions? And could we or should we, especially if you take if you are in the perspective of the minority, accept divisions that could eventually endanger you? How can a minority perspective make itself be heard across a divisive and discriminative social system? Here is also the question, what function can self-organization and eventually art as a space of negotiation have in such a context? And for me personally, a very crucial question is, what role can I, as someone who chooses to work in such a context, together with people who don't have a choice, what can my role be in this context if I don't want to fall into a paternalistic role? So these are the questions that I bring to this morning, together with my gratefulness, really. I think I don't repeat this, but it's very nice to work with all of you. And I'm extremely happy that all the speakers from Georgia, from the States, from England, Germany, could find the time to come. And really, thanks to you, audience, make yourself heard. That would be nice. Yes, will we leave you alone?
No, I'm all by myself. Thank you so much, Michaela, Marcel, for this great introduction. So I won't repeat everything. My name is Raphael Gigas. I'm the curator of Frieze project. When I got appointed as curator last year, it was very important for me to have this discursive element. As you all know, Frieze project is the non-profit program of Frieze Art Fair. Frieze Art Fair, you might know, it happens in a park over there. When I got appointed, I wanted to have a very diverse program. Diversity was kind of one of my key words. This year we added, or the idea was really to invite artists that involve themselves with communities in very different kind of ways. And so also we will discuss one of the projects later. Actually, as the last project, we will discuss the project by Bauer. He collaborated with Peckham Platform, so we will have a round table with that. And I'm excited to hear more. So we already heard it is a great synergy that happened last year, and that was for me the reason also to continue this, to have it also again this year, this one-day symposium. I thought last year it was amazing and it was very productive, and so that's why we're back again here. It's like Groundhog Day, and yeah, probably next year again, we hope. So I'm happy to introduce our first speaker today. He came from New York. He's called Lauren McAlpin. For us as programmers, it was very important not just to have a look at the now, but also to have maybe one look back. To have like one talk that really tries to investigate a very successful example of what art historians would call art activism, or art that really engages with society. Lauren McAlpin is not just an artist and a media producer based in New York City, but he was also a founding member of the AIDS activist art collective Grand Fury. Grand Fury, some of you might know it, was active between 1988 and 1995, so it's really in the past. It's kind of a project that ended in 95. They created a lot of public art projects. They also had gallery shows. They exhibited in the United States, in Europe. They probably are one of the most famous artists collectives that dealt with questions of AIDS and tried to create awareness. And we will hear more from Lauren now. It's a presentation, and then we will have an FAQ, and I hope you will have a lot of questions. So, welcome, Lauren.
Good morning. So, I'm here to offer a case study, not a template for a movement today, but a history of an activist movement that made a mark. Even if we can't find the PowerPoint. Oh, here it is.
Ah, this one.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with 1987. When there were 3,000, basically 34,000 AIDS cases reported in the US, and that was quite underreported, and there were 20,000 deaths. And basically there was no response from any of the governmental or levels, federal, state, local. So you found a community in New York whereby people were dying all around us and nothing was happening. So there was a very clear divide. There was a community that was really experiencing a life and death situation, and there were public officials that were doing nothing about it. We knew that as a community we were incapable of acting against the epidemic alone, and the only chance we had was to work collectively to shame those in power to respond more effectively. So these were the conditions in which the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power were born. And that was 1987. A guy named Larry Kramer had the wherewithal to organize a community meeting where this movement began. And within a year, there were literally hundreds of people coming every week to participate. So the stakes of the epidemic were life and death, and no response was not an option. The direct action that we engaged in was a prophylactic to despair, a reminder to be vigilant, not simply in our own sexual lives, but in the public realm. So, how do you build a movement? One way you do that is by organizing symbols that build group cohesion and communicate to the world that something is wrong. And one of the first things that was done, this was actually preceded the ActUp Coalition by a few months. There was a small group of people, I think there were 6 of them, called the Silence Equals Death Project, that designed this logo. And at first it was simply a number of wheat pastes that were put on storefronts and empty billboards downtown that had this symbol on it, which took essentially the pink triangle that the Nazis used to mark homosexuals, inverted it, and put the slogan underneath, Silence Equals Death. As the movement grew, it became a kind of it was an invitation for people to join and to ask questions about what it meant. By itself, it's a little bit oblique, but to the extent that this was plastered everywhere by people in the movement, it became part of a public discourse, and it led people to ask what it meant and what was going on, because in many ways, many people didn't really even know what was happening. People outside of the gay community were really kind of isolated from the effects of what was happening. There's a temptation to look at the work that we did as art, but I'd like to point out that we really came together primarily as activists. And the movement was there first. So ActUp started. This obviously eventually came to France, and there's a great movie right now called Beats Per Minute, if you've heard of it, that makes into a narrative film the dynamics of the movement that I suggest you see if you're interested. There's also a documentary called How to Survive a Plague and United in Anger that revisits the movement. So, after a few months of meeting, there was a curator at the New Museum named Bill Olander who invited ActUp to use the window space that the museum had on Broadway and to do whatever they wanted with it. So within ActUp, a group formed and put together this installation, which was called Let the Record Show, where we staged a sort of Nuremberg Trial of our own. And in the foreground, you can only see one of them, were 6 public figures who had said things in public that we felt were discriminatory and standing in the way of developing a policy agenda that would adequately approach or to deal with the AIDS crisis. We had an LED, which you can just see as a red blur there above, because this is a time-lapse photograph. But in that, we provided statistics about the scope of the epidemic and just information. And then at the top, you can see again, we sort of used what, but even by that point, which was only a few months into the movement, had become a sort of emblem. And I was at a show the other day at the Whitman Museum right now, protest art, and I saw a poster by the Black Panthers, and I had never made the connection before, but it was similar in that there was kind of a logo that built group identity, and for us, it was that symbol. So after this window and what was I think a successful reception, a lot of people were writing about it and kind of asking questions, there was a group within ActUp that decided that we would continue to meet together and figure out ways that we could use art to broadcast the messages and the strategies of ActUp. At first it was very informal and people came and went. Some people were artists in their daily lives, other people were not. Some people were in film. There was no criteria for joining, it just was an open committee. And we decided to call ourselves Grand Fury, which we thought was a rather grand way of talking about rage. It was also the model of the squad car that was used by the New York Police Department, and it had a sort of campy element. So we like to use humor in our work, and I'll have to say, in spite of the seriousness and the life and death stakes of the movement, there was always, right behind that, a kind of humor that I think allowed us to carry the work through, because it's sort of impossible to maintain a high-pitched, intense response over a long period of time. This was the first project we did, and it came at a time when, even though the attention that was being given to AIDS assumed that it was a problem only for the lesbian and gay community, and even there it was primarily gay men. In the Bronx at that point, there were studies that were showing that mothers were being tested when they gave birth, and 1 out of, I think it was 61 babies, or 1 out of 61 mothers born in the Bronx were testing positive. So it was a clear sign that, in fact, this was an invisible epidemic, and it was showing up primarily in communities of color. So we were trying to make a connection between stigma and invisibility. The stigma of the gay community with the invisibility of communities of color. So in some sense, this was a really early intersectional work, because we were trying to complicate the way that people understood AIDS and show that its effects were much greater. And the implications of that obviously were that it was going to spread much outside of the gay community. So ActUp met weekly, and there was never any centralized power. It really operated through a constellation of affinity groups, and that coordinated amongst each other and had agreed upon goals largely. And so one of our tactics was to have very public demonstrations periodically that drew attention and created arrest scenarios where the public could see what we were doing and to really disrupt business as usual. The first actions were actually on Wall Street. And for the first one, we did something very simple. We, aside from being arrested, many of us were arrested ourselves. I lay down on the street and was arrested. We created this fake money. And obviously that communicated to people who were passing by, several thousand people that saw us on the street, but it created a visual. So we knew that the media was going to look at this, and it was really creating ways to extend the impact and the message more broadly. So if you were on the street, we made like thousands of these, so they were kind of littered all over the street, and they got attention. And it was something easy. At that point, we had no money. We had Xerox machines that people had access to at work. You know, you could go out and buy a sheet of green paper and go crazy. Very simple. And in the beginning, that's really all we had. We had essentially paper and wheat paste and crews of people that signed up and said, yes, I'll go out and I'll wheat paste this flyer all over the city. A little further on, in one of the subsequent actions that was really targeting the New York City and state response, we decided to create a fake New York Times. And this is actually a rare instance where we were able to communicate messages that were more complex than slogans, which we were mostly limited to when we were doing posters. So we actually wrote articles. We produced a 4-page spread. These are 2 of the pages. And we went out, we printed probably 3,000 of these, and we went out and we wrapped newspapers that were, in those days, you know, if you put $1 in, you could open a box and have access to a whole stack of papers. So we would put $1 in and take all the papers out and wrap them overnight. And so, I mean, in this case, maybe there were only a few hundred people that actually bought the paper and opened it up and had a moment of, like, what the hell is going on. But to the extent that we were addressing the major newspaper of New York City and perhaps the nation, it got attention from other media outlets. So in this case, the effect, again, was to broadcast a message into a broader media landscape. Part of this was also in response to, at the time, the New York Times had published an editorial that essentially said, oh, these activists are exaggerating things, it's not so bad. So we were specifically drawing attention to their faulty coverage. This was another project around the same time. Had a very simple message that you could adapt to, you know, various levels of government, and we attacked specific commissioners of health and the federal government, and it was very easy to spread around. People would take cans of red paint and go around, and through the city you could just see these red handprints around. So again, it was about creating a visual reminder throughout the city. This was a project that we did with Art Forum. And, you know, we were lucky that the art world really needed a response. At that point, they didn't really know how to respond. A lot of people within the art world were being affected, and we became sort of a vehicle for the art world to express their concern and their dollars. And so we were very lucky. We had access to Art Forum, to museums, we had invitations to do projects, and that was very helpful because it expanded, again, our reach. It gave us a platform. It gave us sort of loudspeakers, if you will, that we would not have ordinarily have had. We were at the same time very clear about what the terms would be. We, as a group, decided that we would never do a project that did not have a public aspect as its primary venue. So we actually didn't really show in galleries. We always made sure we were doing projects that were either at the front of the museum in the window, or more typical was a poster project that existed outside of the museum, or a bus project, because we didn't want to be confined to such a limited audience. And we never sold anything. We could have, and people asked us, well, why didn't you produce artwork that you could have sold and then made money and funded things? But we realized that to get involved in any kind of market aspect would be a distraction and would really require a tremendous amount of work to maintain and take us away from the real issues at hand. And I think that was actually a pretty smart move. But again, we were lucky because we were being given money to do projects by the art world. And at a certain point, as you'll see, when it comes to buying advertising space, that costs money. So in this project, we were given 4 pages in art form, and this was the editorial I was talking about. We just wanted to point fingers at the ways in which the AIDS discourse was being controlled. In this case, and they were very simple. We just took, a quote that we found from someone within the pharmaceutical industry that's pretty shocking when you think about it. And especially when you think about what the market is now for ARVs, antiviral medication, it's billions. So that lacked a lot of foresight on their part. And here we have Barbara Bush, who, we were pointing out the fact that she could hold a black baby to talk about AIDS because it was an innocent victim, and that was sort of the way that concern was being expressed by public figures in these very safe venues dealing with safe, HIV positive subjects. So this was an art event where we just wanted to remind everyone that that the answer to our struggle was really taking direct collective action. This is a project, again, that we did after the invitation from the Public Art Fund, and they did a project called Art on the Road, where they asked some artists to create public bus side projects. And so we came up with this that tackled a number of different things. We were tackling homophobia, very visually here. We were trying to put forward imagine a world with diversity, and we were trying to name again what we saw as being the primary obstacles: corporate greed, government inaction, and public indifference. We were also mimicking a campaign at the time. Benetton had a campaign of these, silhouettes. So we were very consciously trying to create something that really looked like it belonged in the space of a bus side, so that there would be a moment of shock of, wait a minute, like, who's producing this? And so we were trying to steal really the authority of an advertiser. And disappointingly, because the Public Art Fund had corporate sponsors, when this went up outside of New York, the corporate sponsors said, wait a minute, you have to take that tagline off. And we were faced with the choice of, do we let this go up without that or not? And it was a very difficult choice, because really the bottom message is the most important message. This was also trying to attack, at the time people thought that you could get HIV from kissing saliva. So there was on the top level that very basic message, no you can't. But we decided to go ahead with it anyway because we felt like it was still countering homophobia. It was trying to give out a message saying that it's okay to kiss each other. And we negotiated the production of this poster, which we disseminated through ActUp as sort of a compromise. So in the end, you know, the message got around in this form, and even without that message, this was in Chicago. It went up with just that kissing doesn't kill, right? It seemed fairly innocuous, but there was a group of evangelical Christians that didn't like it. Mostly, ironically, black pastors who went around the city and defaced all of them. But even in that case, it produced a big media event. All the papers discussed it. So in a way, it actually got even more exposure because of the attempt to censor it. The best response we had to it, and I don't have a picture of it, was in San Francisco. There was some lesbians went around and painted out the heterosexual and the gay couple. so there was only a lesbian couple, which was kind of funny. We were asked at a certain point to represent America in the Venice Biennale in 1989 in the aperto section. And you know, at this point, we were going international, which was tricky because I think in many ways the movement did its best work when it was looking at local issues or issues at the federal level. But we decided, what the hell, we've got the Vatican we can address. And so we came up with a piece called The Pope and the Penis. And in this case, we just looked at a quote that was delivered by John Cardinal O'Connor, who was at the time the acting bishop in New York City, who said, "The truth is not in condoms or clean needles, these are lies. Good morality is good medicine," which was pretty easy to take on. And we had this text, which you can read, but basically we're taking them to task for that. And then we had this poster, these are really billboard size, this message right next to it. Ironically, the work was held up, and I think to this day that it was simply a matter of customs forms. But we'll never know entirely. Some people thought it was because of the content of the billboards, whereas I actually think they didn't know what it was. I think it was just bureaucracy. But it created a situation where the Biennale was opening all around us, and our work wasn't there, and we were the only people who didn't have our work. So we made a little, you can see some writing on the wall there. We had a little manifestation in our stall, and again, it was on the front pages of all the newspapers, and we used it really as a platform to have a discussion in the press about AIDS and condoms and whatnot. So again, many of our projects really function to create a debate and have the larger society talking about these issues. And there was always a fine line that you had to tread between what you knew was going to pass muster, that you weren't going to alienate an audience or a sponsor, but you were going far enough to provoke a response. This was another project that we got money for, and it was in the bus shelters in LA, in San Francisco, New York. It came at a time when women were dying from opportunistic infections, but they weren't getting a diagnosis of AIDS because the CDC was not recognizing that the opportunistic infections that women got specifically were related to HIV. So it meant that they weren't eligible for what funding there was, and it meant that the epidemic was being undercounted and underreported and really not recognized. So we had a catchy slogan, which was true. We had specific information that gave the reason for why women were dying without recognition. And, you know, we had this visual that, again, was sort of shocking. You don't really expect to see that. And there was a debate, even within the group, about whether that was right, because it was the women of color were largely the women that were dying at that point. But, you know, we were trying to point out that it was exactly the obsession on the perfect female body and the white perfect female body that allowed for this kind of discrimination to happen. And they were, fortunately, they were translated in Spanish, and many were okay. This was in LA, actually. So this was another big project that we had. This was where we really got big. We had these big billboards, and our message was super simple, but at that time, it was poignant, and we're still struggling with national health care today, unfortunately, and it's going backwards. This was just an ironic case where, in this instance, we had no idea who was going to be next to us, and it just so happened that the advertiser decided to keep airing up next to us, and it's a funny juxtaposition that was completely fortuitous. So I'm going to skip sort of to the end of our career. We really sort of stopped working in '92, I think. Maybe in '90, we might have done a few more things, but in those 5 years, a tremendous amount of things happened. We had, for the first time in '92, there were AIDS organizations that had established, that were well-funded and were able to really take on advocacy. We had people within ActUp who were not trained as scientists, who taught themselves the science and were then on federal, like, Centers of Disease Control and FDA panels, teaching the scientists how to reform the drug approval process. So we were really on the inside of the science at that point. And even though in '92 there were not yet treatments for the disease, and that would take another 4 years until '96, until ARVs were broadly released and really changed AIDS from being essentially a death sentence to being a manageable disease. After 5 years of sort of nonstop screaming and advocating, the group, it got complicated because the messages that you had to communicate were getting increasingly complex. So the messages were more complex. We had people on the inside. There was sort of burnout. And then people were dying. They were still dying. There was a period from '92 to '95 when it was, I think that had a huge impact because people just burn out. So even though we didn't know it at the time, I think a tremendous amount had been achieved. The public was aware. Bill Clinton was in office. He was actually doing the right thing. There were people who were on all the panels and really reforming the drug approval process. But the movement kind of lost a certain amount of strength. So the last project that we did was really just addressed to the ActUp community itself. And at that point, there was starting to be a kind of divide that was being felt between people who were HIV positive and people who were HIV negative. And it's the most emotive thing that we ever did, because we were asking people to consider what was going on for them emotionally as we were experiencing a sort of fragmenting of the movement. Even as things were going on that were very good, as a large-scale movement, it was a little bit falling apart. And I don't want to make you think that we didn't have successes. I think we had tremendous successes. I think the fact that we have ARVs today is a testament to that. One of the things that happened around this time was we introduced the work that we were doing to people in South Africa, Zaki Apek in particular, who took some of the strategies that we developed to South Africa and started a movement that really took on big pharma and really took on the pricing structure, so that within a few years, the pricing for ARVs, and this was actually after '96, went from being, $15,000 to a few hundred. So the work continued on. I think part of the success of ActUp and Grad Fury was that we kept our goals very, very focused, so that, and they were attainable goals. We were aware that much of the AIDS crisis flourished because of huge issues: income inequality, racism, homophobia, sexism. And that was always in the background. But in the foreground, we always identified some clear policy goals that were achievable. And we were able to achieve that. And I think that was, again, had a lot to do with the successes that we had, is that we were not trying to change the world. We were inviting the world to change, but that we wanted very specific things that would have concrete effects to be changed. I'm sure I've missed a lot here, but I'm willing to take any questions anyone might have.
Joking again. I have a lot of questions, but I see that there are also people.
Yeah, I have.
There is a microphone if you.
I can yell.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to give a disclosure. I'm a virologist, and I've worked on AIDS my whole life. So, and I just want to compliment you on something. In the early days, this is in '83. I'll just give a comment. When I started at NIH, so I'm working in America. I come from Amsterdam, and we worked on AIDS drugs. And the reason we worked on AIDS drugs was the push of the insider, which was your community, if I may say so. And it first irritated us immensely. But in a few years, and particularly in Amsterdam, was a very, let's say, influential community. And I think the reason, so you can take more credit than you actually took, because I think the reason there are hundreds of drugs currently licensed is for that early moment of the discovery, as well as the diagnostics, as well as the viral load test, which was measuring, I mean, essentially it was the more virus you have, the quicker you get HIV and AIDS, or AIDS to be precise. Now, why I'm saying this is this is for this meeting, the problem of the insider and the outsider. You come from the inside, pushed us as outsiders, which is the scientific community, into getting interest in this problem. And then I was lucky to be a virologist, to be interested so much that I spent almost 20 years and we're still working on vaccines and cures. But what I'm saying here for this meeting is relevant, is it's either inside out or outside in. In other words, what I see immediately is the problem that you pushed us as the scientific community into interest in your problem. But all you showed was from the inside. It's how to convince the outside. So I think that the biggest compliment is what is the, say, community of the problem, the people, the owners of the problem, what are they doing in interaction with the people who actually are allies or have to become allies to the problem. But I wanted to make you the compliment that the reason we worked on it was the community, first of homosexual men, and then it took in hemophiliacs, which were, of course, also getting into IV drug use.
And I would further that point by saying I think the reason that we were allowed in ultimately, although at first I know it was an irritation and there was kind of like, who the hell are these kids, was that they did their homework. And so they were able to come and address you scientists, at a level that made you realize, wait a minute, these kids, they know what they're talking about. So there was a tremendous amount of work that they did in really teaching themselves the issue and then analyzing the issues to see where the obstacles were in a way that the scientists, I think, were having problems kind of seeing where they could move faster or where they could redesign, you know, a trial to be more compassionate. So, yeah, there was a treatment and data committee, a group of really about 20 guys that really just did a remarkable work. And they continue actually to be involved today. One of them, a guy named David Barr, is sort of the architect for international movement for treatment preparedness. So it really was kind of like a boot camp for the leaders of an international treatment movement that continues to have impact today.
And this is the last point I want to make on this. You mentioned Clinton, but I always mention Bush because it's more surprising that the most influential worldwide drug dispersal system is PEPFAR. And that program was started under Bush because he considered it a health and security risk for the world, and it's still moving on. So that's an interesting political assessment of how right and left are not totally congruent with the biggest problems in the world.
No, there are so many questions.
Sorry, you're right. You talked quite early on about bringing together a constellation of affinity groups, and you made that sound pretty easy. I wondered if you could just talk about that. How do you bring these groups together?
It was a little bit like herding cats, but actually people within that large group, I think if you were interested in the movement, you suddenly realized that you had to identify your particular interests and then find other people that were interested in the same thing. So, you know, groups naturally formed. People who were interested in housing, people who were interested in how AIDS affected women, people who were interested in taking the media to task. And so those groups naturally formed. But because there was a weekly meeting, that's when everyone came together and discussed usually these larger actions, but it was also a way of just keeping everyone informed about the broader world of what was going on with AIDS. So there was this tension between the small groups that met individually outside of those meetings and then the large group. And it was never easy. And if you see this movie I'm talking about, Beats Per Minute, you can really see there was this constant struggle to kind of keep sort of more radical elements that wanted to go and really blow things up in line with the rest of the group that thought, no, we're a disciplined, non-violent group. You know, we're not going to do anything violent. So I can only say that when you have a pressing problem with stakes that are like life and death, and there's a wisdom in that large group that can somehow sort of take control. There were also times when the movement sort of ate itself up, and there were terrible fights, and in the end, in '92, one of the reasons why the group had, I think, less focus, aside from burnout, was there was a tension between the people who were getting access to the inside and then people in the group who resented that and thought they were selling out. But, so, you know, it's a negotiation. But it was really that structure of weekly meetings with no central authority, although there were facilitators, but there was not, there was not a top-down level of organization. It was diffuse. But it gave really people the opportunity to kind of get excited and do their own thing.
I just wanted to say, first of all, how influential ActUp and Grand Fury were in the UK in the late 80s and early 90s, and created huge hope at a time where actually resistance and collective expressions and activism was not fashionable in the art world at all. It was a huge inspiration for many of us. So it's wonderful to kind of be here and to hear you talk about this. But I also just wanted to ask you what you thought about the explosion of young political activist collective practices across the world today. And because I'm really struck by the fact that you identify, you emphasize the fact that your group had very definable goals, looked for very specific strategic objects of change, and how that compares with groups like Central Political Beauty, Paul Chan's Badlands, Visible Collective, Pen Collective. I mean, there's thousands of these, Superflex. I could go on sort of mentioning all these collectives across the world, but very few of them have very specific goals. And I was just wondering, what your take was on this new explosion of political activists, collective practices that we have now.
I think, not to take credit, but I do think that the work of Grand Fury and Group Material and General Idea, who were other collectives at the time that were working, did spawn interest and we're seeing the effects of that. That there was an idea planted like, hey, we can be a collective in an art world, and we don't have to practice with thinking of the market primarily as the way that we engage in the art world. And in some sense, I think it's sort of the counterpoint to the ways that the art world has become even more market identified. We have this sort of side part of the art world that's resisting that and having collective practices, which I think is very interesting. But you do point out, I think, something that's also crucial, which is to what extent are those practices engaged just in an art world, and in what ways are they connected to larger social and political worlds? And I can't comment on them individually, but I think that's hard. I think Grand Fury was successful because there was really a very stark epidemic going on. And so we had certain access and permissions that I think are not typically granted. So we were kind of at an ideal moment for something to happen. But I think collective practices are great, and I hope that the ones that are working are thinking about, well, how is this having an impact outside of the art world? Not that the art world can't have its own collective moments, but is how much effect does it having?
There was one more question in the back.
So, first of all, thank you for your presentation, very interesting. And I think the work that you all did is amazing, how you utilize art to raise awareness and mobilize people. I wondered if you could comment on what's happening with the AIDS epidemic now, because I've been reading lots of articles that in, first of all, like, let's say developed countries, AIDS is on the rise because people kind of forgot about the whole, using condoms when having sex, and the index has been rising.
I think in America, and it's hard for me to speak about an international situation, although from what I understand, there are tremendous pressures now internationally that relate to financing and the financing of ARV treatments that are available in third world and middle-income countries is being reduced. And if that is the case, that could be a disaster, because you have a situation where there are populations that have been on antiretroviral treatment for years that may no longer have access to that. And that could really have a huge impact. But in the States, where we're finding a rise is, again, it's in communities of color. There is a rise in transmission among young men of color who are not getting access to some of the things like PrEP, which is a prophylaxis treatment that is much more, it's more available and more widely used by white, gay, bisexual men. So I think in most of the population, there is still, you know, to the extent that people are on ARVs, people are taking prophylaxis to prevent transmission in the beginning. I think rates have come down, but in certain key populations, it's still a problem, and that has to do with, you know, long-standing discriminations in poverty, racism, all of that. So yeah, it's not over, and those are still big, you know, struggles. So we didn't end the AIDS crisis. We just sort of got it more controllable in certain populations.
Okay, we have one last question.
Just sort of struck me that it's in a very just pre-digital world that this happened. And I just wondered if this sort of epidemic happened now, how would you go about it? Or how successful do you think the strategies you used in the past would be operational now?
When we started, it was pre-digital. We cut and pasted things. And you know, you have to wonder whether, like some of the things like the Kissing Doesn't Kill campaign, which at that time seemed revolutionary, but now any kid can use Photoshop and in 10 seconds create something that looks like, you know, it's Nike or Coke or whatever. So I think you're right. I think that might be visible now. And I can't say what the strategy would be. I think that if there was another epidemic that had the sort of stark terms that the AIDS crisis had for the gay community in New York, they'd figure out a way. And I can't say exactly what it was. I mean, obviously, the strategies change as the technologies change, and I'm sure it would look very different. My guess is that it would be more of a web-based kind of response. Although I do continue to think that bodies on the street make a difference, and the fact that we were able to create, you know, demonstrations that had thousands of people at it, that does have power that just a virtual thing doesn't always, you know, compete with. But it would look very different, and who knows what it would look like. I wish I could say, I can point to something that's happening now that is a contemporary response. But it would be different for sure.
Lauren, thank you so much for this inspirational talk. I think we still have a lot of questions that we have to go on in the program. I also have dozens of questions, but we have lunch break. Coffee break. Sorry. No, first we had one more talk. No? Oh yeah, now coffee break. So during coffee break, you will get more questions. Thank you so much.
Anyway, my food. I know. If you can come back in 15 minutes, that'll be great. And then come back.
Thank you.
Frieze.
No, I gotta go to the get a Oh, das ist Kuba.
You guys, you know, raise.
Oh, sorry. I'll move that chair for now.
So are you resident or? Okay. Well, very nice to meet you. Thanks for all the work that you've done. Right. What's the church? Is it? Okay. And is it what's the denomination? Okay.
Amazing.
Oh yeah, the church is not on board.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. Can we get you coffee or something?
Oh, I'm looking. I have a friend here that I've got to go find.
You're busy now, but lovely to meet you. Absolute inspiration. I was in the States during the time of my neighbors died, so
When there's still things to fight for.
Oh, yeah. Good morning.
All right. Bye-bye.
That's amazing.
Good.
Yeah.
By the wayside, but I could manage.
They're all out there.
Is there coffee out here or is it on the
Shall I bring you down to that? I can go and get some. Do you want to get some?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Oh, it's very good. So you did that. That fun for you. Nice to meet you. Hello. Dennis. Showing the slides the country we're going to be today.
Oh, good. I wish I could. It's hard to sort of answer that question more specifically. But you know what I mean. You can tell us. I will.
Exactly, which I think is so good because it doesn't look very comfortable. Good, and next is Mark. Yeah.
Nee, aber du kannst, aber was nicht jetzt vielleicht eine Technik sehr hilfreich bei Frieze. I mean, I just wrote him down. He reacted. That's perfect, I guess. Yeah. Or he wants to see the audience, so maybe, yeah, let's do it like this, like yesterday. Because that was his wish.
For a 26-year-old.
Mother would be high.
Yeah. So it's going to be in job or
Wirklich? Ja. Oh, wow.
Das sind beide Ausstellungen. Gruppenausstellung, das ich gemacht habe in Georgien und in Bäder. Und das ist eine deutsch-georgische Ausstellung mit vielen Künstlern, die du kennst.
Wirklich? Danke, das war interessant.
Ja, sicher, alles. Also ich finde ganz interessant allgemein die Auffassung. Ja, also auch was du gesagt hast, die Instrumentalisierung der Kunst.
Das ist eine große Diskussion, die mich wirklich interessiert.
Ich habe auch meine eigene Position.
Ja, ja. Es ist eine Diskussion, aus der man ein eigenes Panel machen könnte oder ein Symposium, weil es wirklich schwierig ist, finde ich.
Ja.
Ja, mit Dagmar bin ich mir gar nicht einig in dieser Frage.
Okay. Das ist das größte Fehler, das man macht.
Glaubst du auch?
Dann steht die Essenz von
Das finde ich auch. Ja.
Was ich glaube, ist eine andere Sache, die auch praktiziert wird, aber nicht wahrgenommen. Die Leute sagen, wie ich finde, er hat zum Beispiel Kreativität, hat eigentlich als Künstler wie eine Kunstarbeit ganz aktiv. Und das ist
ja, genau.
Er hat instrumentalisiert, er hat das ja, so habe ich das verstanden.
Und ich glaube, es macht auch einen Unterschied, ob du in der Machtposition bist oder in der Minority-Position. Weil wenn, also, es ist eine komplexe Diskussion. Ja.
But this is family and the is part of this museum, but they're very part of the director. At the moment it's closed. But then part of the capital structure, how many work there? So it's a large structure with a kind of collection bay, typical museum.
That's a long time ago.
50,000 works. 100,000. It's like it's a collecting and based on a lot of donations and stuff like this, it's a proper share. And but then also the temporary spaces or so like basically temporary exhibition collection. So ask this fellow I'm not sure if Manchester is ready for that. But do they really want it? They might say that they want it. You know. So what's
Well, then let's, yeah.
Even if it's
Hi, how are you? Yeah, you did very well, thank you, very well. Yeah. It's great. Yeah, really, that was a great start.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Great start. Morning.
Hi.
Perfect. Thank you very
Yeah, I think we have to say it all the time.
the UK.
What should I do? Should I call it?
But then, on the other hand, well, it needs to be Germany, and not really
Das Land ist erst die
en dat hij dus deze mannen niet weet. Zo dus. Nee, zo daarom keek ik zo, ik dacht, oh mijn god. Ik was al maar ik moet ook geen beweging zelf echt wel.
Die Leute sind gerade so rein. Wir hören dich nicht, ich muss ganz kurz aber es dauert noch 1 Minute. Du kannst dich auch kurz genau. Oder wir können die Videokamera weil
Hij is goed, hè?
Vielleicht sollte es deine Kamera jetzt aufnehmen, weil man sieht nicht.
Maar hij werkt namelijk dat werk even met dat soort hij is Zwitser, maar hij is heel goed. Ja, daar heb deze even checken of ergens. Maar pap, ik wil nog iets zeggen. Ik weet niet wat
Good. I think we should continue. All right. Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker, who is here now. Yes, exactly. Mark Terkesidis. It's kind of a break after the Grand Fury presentation, but we'll find a way to make connections, I think. Mark is in Santorini, a fact that we try to ignore now.
It's raining.
It's raining.
Don't worry.
Great. Usha, please, could you stay here so that we see if the sound quality is good enough and everything? Okay, thank you. Mark Terkesidis is an author and a researcher in the field of migration studies, I would say. Probably I'm mistaken. You're also a member of the Academy of the Arts of the World. And Mark has authored many books that unfortunately are not translated in English. Where is Catherine and Mario from Goethe Institute? Exactly, it's also kind of a hint to you. There are really quite seminal books, actually, that discuss cultural dynamics even before I realized that they are there. So in 2010, Mark published Interculture. In 2015, a book called Collaboration, and now the most recent book is called Nach der Flucht, so after the flight or after displacement. They all have in common that they discuss perspectives of, I would say, maybe post-migrant societies, considering the psychology of racism and the dynamics of, as I said, collaboration or self-organization, and also the various needs for a reorganization of societal structures. I think that's all I want to say. I would leave the stage to you. Maybe we first have to see how the sound quality is. So when you start talking, I might interrupt you because we have to
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, thanks for having me, although I cannot be in London at the time. It would have been too complicated to fly there and fly again to Zurich after that. I'm very interested in the topic because it was the topic I did the full collaboration on. And let me start with the encounters I had with the art world recently, and it's quite interesting that there is such a strong critique of neoliberalism in the art world. For example, take the Documenta 14 in Athens, especially the part which was in Athens. And Athens was evidently chosen because it illustrated the so-called catastrophe of neoliberal policy. And so it had to happen in the imagined ruins of Athens and claimed to learn from Athens at the same time. So if you happen to see this part of the Documenta, there was actually unclear what there was to learn, and the exhibition ignored Greece and Athens in large parts. So the Documenta 14, furthermore, was known as the Documenta with the most despicably exploitative work conditions. So that is quite interesting that there is a critique of neoliberalism in the art world, and there is evidently an adoption of activist strategies in the art world, while if it comes to the organization of work and so on, is one of the most neoliberal places we have in the sectors of the society. So that is pretty much an interesting contradiction, and so it's the starting point of talking about collaborative art or about activist art is the critique of its most hypocritical manifestations. And in a way, this kind of Documenta 14 exhibition of activism actually devaluates real activism because it becomes kind of an art spectacle. The second point I want to raise is that art itself in recent times has become, in a way, conceptually and aesthetically, I don't have to tell you that, borderless. That means that, in a way, art takes every kind of assignment now. That means art is there to solve problems of every kind, to mend broken societies, in a way to help the underprivileged, to do integration and community cohesion, and so on. In Germany, you know that we recently had a vast flight of refugees coming to the Federal Republic, and there is one institution called the Deutsche Kulturrat, which does actually champion the people working in the cultural institutions, and they actually, Deutsche Kulturrat means German Cultural Council, and they actually made a proposition that artists should go to the then still their refugee camps, and the artists have to work with the refugees there, and what were they doing when they were working with them. They should give them some pastime because waiting in the refugee camp is so boring, and they should mend them in terms of helping them to deal with the traumatization. So it's not a joke. It's actually what this German Cultural Council proposed to artists working in refugee camps. And I can only say I am a psychologist, and I can only say beware of artists. You know, because if they really try to work with people with the traumatization, that is a dramatic overestimation of the role of art. And in Germany, in those times, there were organizations supporting refugees, social organizations supporting refugees, and they actually told artists not to call them anymore. Because there were so many artists proposing art projects, and they were doing these kind of requests, please do send me 10 refugees, I have a project. So that was like, that is what I meant with the art on taking every kind of assignment in search of support, of money for sure, of culture, a new role in society. So if artists do research and they do social work and they do therapy, and if they explore topics, one has always to ask who is actually the subject. So if Olafur Eliasson, who did a project with refugees in Germany, does a project with refugees, then the only subject there is Olafur Eliasson. The rest of the people participating in the project stay actually without a name. They were helped by the artists by learning something about creating lamps and so on. So what I said now sounded like if I was like kind of a sharp critic of collaborative art, but I am not. I'm actually a champion of collaborative art because I basically think that it is the most contemporary art. Marcel introduced me as somebody who was like thinking about how society, post-migrant, post-modern societies are structured. And I mean, one of the preconditions of thinking about the society now is that these societies are a multiplicity. If it comes to milieus, if it comes to values, if it comes to historical backgrounds, if it comes to ethnic origins, and even if it comes to individual reference frames, these societies, postmodern, post-migrant societies, are a multiplicity. So there is an inevitable need for collaboration to negotiate the differences of diversity, of multiplicity in these societies. So if it comes to art, artists evidently choose collaboration because they, in a way, want finally to quit the idea of the individual creating from the midst of his or her soul. And meanwhile, we know from this kind of art that there is not a lot to be found in the midst of the soul, except for cliches. They choose it because they feel the need, they don't feel the need to be emancipated anymore, because they have the freedom already, or if they don't have the freedom, they blame themselves for not having the freedom, so there is no need for emancipation anymore. So artists choose collaboration because they want to make sense of the world in another way. They want to contribute, and that is important to the pressing questions of the world, and they want to work together with others, negotiate the common ground with others, do commoning, as it was called in a recent text about the new social movement in Greece. So in a way, these artists still draw the consequences of the changes in the art world of the 60s, from the object to the process, from the creating subject to the enemies of the subjectivity as such. As in the performance art, for example. Lucy Lippert found that interesting, once called community-based arts, the predecessor of the concept art of the 60s. So that is the starting point why collaboration is relevant for art right now. So let me maybe really brief say something about the status of collaboration in the multiplicity in the post-migrant, postmodern society. Maybe you all know this, the idea of discipline with Michel Foucault. Foucault developed the idea that among the institutions of societies of the 19th century, there was the distribution of a power technique called the discipline. So you could see it in the factories, in the schools, in the prisons, and so on. And he explained this idea of the discipline while illustrating it with Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon. So you have a central tower, and from the central tower you could look into the small cells of the individuals. And this kind of structure is actually, you always have the central eye or the issuing office, and you always have the individuals in their cells which are scrutinized and valued, or are the passive recipient for what is issued from the central office. And you see that structure still in schoolrooms, and you see it in theater rooms, and you see that structure if somebody is reading a newspaper still, because that is the structure of issuing office and the individual as a passive recipient of that. And it always included some kind of homogenization process. Benedict Anderson once called the nation an imagined community, and he explained it while illustrating it with a person who reads a newspaper. So this person who reads a newspaper is actually doing an individual act, but on the same time he's doing an individual act, seeing others doing the same individual act, and so that has a homogenization in it. And the other thing is that the language transmitted by these newspapers or mass media, actually not the content of the language, but the structure of the language is the homogenization of the national language on the territory of the nation. And art, in a way, was involved into this kind of homogenization project. A lot of artists were like promoting the art, the culture as the national, as the body of the nation. So if you have multiplicity now, art could be a place to negotiate the difference of aesthetically and effectively. This discipline actually changed, this power technique of discipline came into crisis in the 60s. I cannot tell the whole story now, but evidently there is nothing which took actually the place of this difference, and I think collaboration could be the ethical principle at the institutions, in a way utopian, but nevertheless in the institutions substituting difference. So if you go to one of the better schools right now, if you go to a kindergarten, if you sometimes go to art institutions, you can see people actually working on this kind of collaboration as an ethical principle. Again, back to art in a narrower sense, I remember that Lydia Clark, who did a very interesting project in late 60s and early 70s, said that, like, Estructuras Vivas, that was the interesting collaborative project, said that what she is doing in art was a preparation for life. So evidently this project prepared you for a better life, and it was part of an effort to change society. Evidently it was not the effort itself, it was part of an effort to change society. So this idea of a preparation for life was evidently post-avant-gardist. It was not like the congruence of art and life, but a preparation for life. And I find this thought very, very intriguing, actually. So it makes sense if you think about collaboration and discipline again, and collaboration is a very different array or arrangement as discipline. That means in comparison to discipline, you see people working together, and there is not any kind of panopticon in a Benthamian sense explained by Foucault. So there was one book about performance art, for example, that was called No Innocent Bystanders, and that is very, very different, No Innocent Bystanders, than the idea, for example, of Jacques Rancière of the emancipated spectator, which is actually still in the logic of discipline as I think. So there is a myriad of actually very, very interesting examples in art, how to collaborate, and a lot of them were recently evaluated. If it comes to the propositions of Lucia Clark, for example, David Medalla's participation propulsions, artist placement group, Steve Willard's work, and so on. And recently, artist Jay Coe has written a very interesting book about artist-led participational process, where he really explained in depth how the artist is actually collaborating. And the idea is always to create some kind of collective body, and this collective body always in a way resembles the body of political action. So it is it means to share meaning, to alter the condition of space, to experience different kinds of agency, to construct subjectivities, or to imagine alternatives. So art is in a way an aesthetic social practice. It has borders, and it has difficult borders to political social practice, to educational social practice, to therapeutic social practice, and so on. But it's an aesthetic social practice. Jay Coe actually wrote about that as the artist, when the artist is going into collaboration, one of the decisive categories is listening. Listening to other people, and that principle of listening you find, for example, in free jazz too. So free jazz is based on improvisation, and it's the most democratic form of jazz, if you want. And there is one error about improvisation, and that is that improvisation is there to express yourself. Actually, improvisation is there to listening to others and give them the opportunity to express themselves. And the idea is that they, because you give them the space, they give you the space to express yourself too. So it's not about expressing yourself. So what it's really, really important to first. So if it comes to the negotiation of difference or ethnicity or multiplicity, diversity or multiplicity, I think Stephen Willard's early projects were very interesting, like Metafilter. So these problem display boards he did, and the goal was for people to develop their own heuristics to analyze problems, and at the same time to develop some kind of meta language to negotiate between different layers of society. Last point I want to raise is the point of authority, and I find it very important to talk about authority in collaborative processes. I mean, recently artists and curators, I mean, look at Documenta 14, artists and curators now are international players, and maybe you know international curators yourself. When you're an expert on a certain topic, they call you and they say, give me some names, because they want to combine them into their curatorial project. And so, in a way, these artists and curators as international players are the new geniuses of exploration. They always explore something, and of combination. They always make living tableaus of activist strategies and so on with others. And I think even this kind of idea of exploration, an artist person explores, it has something colonial to it. So you need some kind, and usually it is quite interesting that these artists and curators are quite often are not experts themselves and do not have an agency themselves. So what I mean by authority is that the artist or the curator has to have some kind of authority. And in different dimensions to have some kind of authority, that means skill, could mean skill, it could mean knowledge, it could mean agency for something, agency for a group of people, or agency for some kind of topic. And then you have authority, which means you are trusted if you like propose something that it is sometimes not discussed. So then you have, again, the question is who is the subject, but I think in collaborative processes, it's not that these collaborative processes are without authority. They are not like anarchic discussion group. If you do a collaborative project, and everybody who has done one knows that, then you always have to distribute authority. It doesn't make sense to say there is no authority, but you have to distribute this authority. So you bring your own authorities in, but you make space for the others to display their kinds of authorities. I mean, in Germany, recently there have been so many art projects with newcomers to Germany, refugees in Germany, and I really found it interesting that all these projects, all the makers of these projects, they tell you, we're doing this project, as you say in German, on Augenhöhe, that means at eye level or at equal footing, or something like this in English. And I mean, if you like assert that you do a project on eye level with refugees, then it is actually a lie. You know, it's not possible to do a project on eye level if you are the one who has citizenship, who has like financial resources, who has cultural resources, and you are the one who has like speaks the language properly, and you work together with people who don't have all that. So I mean, if you just assert that there is equality, then you, in a way, like you make authority invisible. So it is necessary to bring your authority in and like to create situations where people have their own authority. So if people come from Syria and they have been designers in Syria, then you can create a situation in a project where they can exercise their, execute their like designer knowledge or something. That means there has to be a distribution of authority. So that was my brief presentation on multiplicity, collaboration, and authority. I can like go on this topic in the dimension of Fidel Castro. Actually, I hope that was a little bit of an impression of what I was thinking about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are. Is it okay? Do you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, I hear you.
Is there any question? Yes?
I can do this without my thanks. I would like to, sorry, hi there. I was really fascinated by the differentiation between the psychology of imposing art, as you said before, and letting art just be the journey. What I would like to find out is, especially in regards to refugees, the differentiation between art and creativity. Because for me that's a very, very different angle to come in as an artist, for instance, to work with refugees or somebody who is not at eye level. So okay. Where do you see,
Mark, did you hear anything?
Yeah, just some parts. I heard the part about the difference between art and creativity, but I'm sorry.
Yes,
most of it was difficult to understand.
To kind of break it down, the question is whether it could make a difference if you approach these kind of works, artists who work in refugee or migrant situations, if you approach it not from the angle of art, but from a more comprehensive, maybe, angle of creativity and creative actions, if it changed something. Also in regard to the question, how can you be on eye level? Or is it even possible? Sorry, does it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, my opinion is I think in Dutch there is this expression of the vormgever that is like somebody who puts form to something, and that is the same expression for artists and for designers. So that is quite interesting that it is seen as something not only which has something in common, but as one in a way. So I mean, if I call it aesthetic social practice, I don't buy into the problem to differentiate between art and creativity. So if you do a project which includes aesthetic social practice, then this problem does simply not occur. And if you consider it as a preparation for life, again, this problem simply does not occur. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if it comes to work with refugees, I mean, there have been some very, very interesting projects. Nevertheless, I have to say that a lot of projects, they were simply the same project which were done with like underprivileged youth in the 70s. You know, same kind of project. That nothing has changed. And so the question is, what do we actually learn from this project? So how is learning organized? What are the problems which occur during the process of this project, and where is the data about the biggest failings you had while doing this project, and how do you like conceptualize the next one? So there's a lot of problems with the status of this project in general.
Mm-hmm. I would have a comment to this, but yeah, I mean, one of the biggest problems for me is that how could you measure what the failings are if you cannot really measure what the successes are, you know? So many projects that aim at social interaction, they don't really have a clear outcome or output or a clear impact, I would say. I mean, for instance, these projects you're referring to with challenged youth, I mean, would it be trustworthy to like then judge, okay, how many of them studied medicine? I mean, it's a weird way to measure an effect or yeah.
But that can't be the purpose of art.
Exactly.
To bring people to study medicine. I mean, that is not that can't be the purpose.
Yeah,
of
but
art.
I mean, often
that is the purpose of
education.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on. It's your stage.
No, please. Yeah.
No, it's probably tricky to have this discussion through Skype, but I find it hard. I mean, I see what you mean. It's somehow this whole sector doesn't accumulate knowledge about its own practices. And I think on the one hand, this is due to the specificity of many projects. Like you cannot say, oh, by working with this community, I came to these and these problems, or I encountered these and these problems, and let's just take it and put it, like transfer it to the work with another community, because each community has different dynamics. So I think it's really tricky to gain knowledge from these experiences. And the other thing is, I think many artists who work in this field struggle a lot to justify what they do in regard to the measurements of effects, of impact and whatever. And I kind of sympathize with artists who really say, I don't know what the effects could be. I kind of sympathize because I think it's a more open and also humane process. At the same time, then it's really hard to say anything about failings or success. In the end, it's only what happens in those who are part of the process who can judge it felt good or not. And this is thing in the end.
Okay, this is a long
yeah.
It could be a very long discussion. Just briefly, I mean, what I mean with failings is, for example, I mean, you start some project, and I mean, I always have the problem of the idea of the community, but we in a way we have to clear the idea of the community before. But nevertheless, you start some kind of project, and people don't want to work with you because they distrust you. because they think you are some kind of spy of the authorities coming into their community, because you said some things which were actually thought of by the people as some kind of inquiry into their life, because you say something simply racist, or you disagree with some kind of cliches about people, and then you have a conflict. That is, people don't want to work with you, and that happens so often. That happens so often, again and again. So where is the data about these kind of failings? I mean failings. I don't mean that the whole project doesn't have an outcome in in an object. You know, that is. I don't mean that. I don't mean that with failing. So, and if it comes to, let's talk about the criteria. I mean, Jaco has written this really interesting book, and he tried to single out some of the criteria in these kinds of projects. But I mean, it's quite easy to say that one project or a project, this project with the elderly women, Susan Lacey did, is a better project than some of the project done with refugee recently in Germany. And so, I mean, let's talk about the criteria for these projects. And I mean, we definitely have to get to the point of financial support, because often this financial support for collaborative projects is coming from the social sector, and it is like connected to an idea of instrumentalization of art, for example, for community cohesion. So you're actually the program which gives you financial support does not say you have to create art, but you have to create some kind of community cohesion. And so we have to develop some kind of criteria from art itself, or from aesthetic social process itself.
Okay.
But that would be actually a collaborative process again.
Okay, there's one more question.
Good time for this. So I just wonder to what extent the word art is getting in the way here. Okay. And many of the collectives, some of the interesting collectives that I know who are working today, really don't give a shit about whether what they're doing is called art or not. They are really organizing themselves and gathering around an object of concern. Mm-hmm. And they are gatherings which are not exclusively artists, but which are people who are concerned about a particular issue which they're wanting to work on in some way. And this whole question about, you know, whether it's good art or not, and whether it ends up in documentary or not, is really of no interest to them. And we see these groups now sort of popping up.
Can I just ask, do you hear anything, Mark?
Yeah, I always hear parts, and other parts are like too not loud enough. Yeah, but I heard a lot of it. It's like,
well, can I just finish the point?
Of course.
I just had one more thing to kind of add to that, which is that I see these groups operating under an alternative kind of category of not art.
Okay.
Not politics. So this is where the whole idea of what it is that they're doing is suspended. And it's actually in a radical suspension. Mm-hmm. So that allows them to get on with the business of what they want to do. And we don't really care whether Claire Bishop thinks that it's good art or not.
Yeah. Oh wow, it's a pity you didn't hear that. Well, first of all, I think the question you raised is whether it makes any sense to differentiate between art and not art. That people...
not art.
No, that's the end point of what you said. She said that many activist groups, they assemble around a concern and not around the question, oh, we should try to make art that eventually could land in documenta. So it's maybe not an appropriate category to speak of art, and also not appropriate to ask, is it good art or not? And then comes the not art and not politics aspect, which I find kind of interesting. So groups who do not say about themselves, we're artists, but they also don't say, we don't do art. But they don't do not art, so to say, yeah? And they don't do not politics, yeah? it might be productive to, yeah. But I think for right now, also already this question, is it worth talking about art in this kind of, what do you think about this?
Yes, because art creates the infrastructure, that's why we're here.
Okay, art creates the infrastructure, that's why we're here.
Yes, definitely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I propose to speak of aesthetic social practice, but nevertheless has to do something with aesthetics. Otherwise, there is absolutely no border to politics or to education or to therapy or other dimensions. So generally, you are right, but I am a pragmatic, and you have to live with the institutions, and you have to live with the programs, and so on. They all speak about art. So in a way, that is like just a pragmatic way. I personally, I don't think. I think that you're absolutely right, and that this gathering around the concern sometimes actually makes the better art. I really like this Chicano art group ASCO, for example, who did work in the 70s, and they were basically activists for La Causa, but they actually wanted to enlarge the field of activism, and then they developed aesthetic practices to include it into their activism, and in a way that was like they were bypassing art, and they were doing aesthetically very interesting things. So in an ideal world, I would say let's drop the idea of art completely, but nevertheless you have to deal with the institutional framework. So, and then I say it again, I'm pragmatic.
Okay. Well, the one who asked you the question, she does not agree about dropping the notion of art. But I think we might have to stop with this discussion, unfortunately, because otherwise the program gets.
I'm really sorry I could not be there.
Yes.
These kind of discussions with Skype are really complicated.
They are, but nevertheless, thank you very much for your input.
Thank you.
And we're recording also the whole symposium, so you'll have. Oh, we're also live on Facebook. Actually.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes, I think, Michaela, you should right away go to the
I'd really like to take the full hour that we've got. I think we need it. Is that all right for everybody that we go a bit into your lunch? Yeah. Great. So would you like to come to the...
You have pictures to show, no, so we have to resolve this problem.
Did you say that this little thing changes then?
Yeah, because...
Should we do mine? Not. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Okay. A big welcome to. Let's sit a bit nearer. Right. A big welcome to you both, to Barbie Asante, to Alistair Hudson. Barbie's going to go first, and then Alistair. Barbie, your work is shown in galleries currently to acclaim at the Baltic. I've been seeing all the Facebook posts and so on. And you have also much experience as a curator and an educator concerned with the politics of space, identity, and the contemporary legacies of colonialism. And happy for us to work both with NEMA and with the Peckham platform, so welcome. And Alistair Hudson, director of NEMA, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, shortly to be heading for Manchester. In Middlesbrough, you're operating, it seems, in Brexit land, and with asylum seekers housed in honestly appalling conditions, for instance. And it seems to me that you've made community part of the gallery and artists part of the community beyond the gallery. So, so welcome to you both, and over to you, Bobby.
I'll tell you a story, if I may. Many years ago, when I first came to London, I was in the British Museum, naturally, and one of the West Indians who worked there started a conversation with me and wanted to know where I was from. And I told him I was from Holland. And that answer didn't satisfy him. And I didn't understand what he meant. I was born in Holland.
I was born in Harlem Hospital, I said. I was born in New York. None of these answers satisfied him. He said, where was your mother born? And I said, she was born in Maryland. And I could see, but I didn't understand it, that he was growing more and more disgusted with me. And so he became more and more impatient. Where was your father born? My father was born in New Orleans. Yes, he said, but man, where were you born? And I began to get it. I said, well, my mother was born in Maryland, and my father was born in New Orleans. And I was born in New York. And he said, but where were you born before that? And I said, well, I don't know. And I could see that he did not believe me. And I tried to explain, you know. There was no way for me to know. He said, don't you care enough to find out? And I tried to explain, if I were originally from Dakar, or from wherever it was in Africa, I couldn't find out.
Where it was, because my entry into America is a bill of sale. And that stops, that stops you from going any further. At some point in our history, I became
Baldwin's nigger.
Baldwin's nigger.
That's how I got my name.
This is a painful declaration of independence. Amma wrote herself a poem, a declaration of independence. Oh, my dear brother, the decision to separate was not based on the knowledge of me as a forever dreamer, unable and incapable of handling the clear world of take and take and take. This, is another declaration of independence for the women who contribute to me, inspire me, keep me alive, my mothers, lovers, sisters, cousins, daughters, comrades. This is for Adjoa, Araba, Nana, Amal, Ancestress, Deborah, Buki, Phoebe, Busty, Sammy, Teresa, Kat, Labita, Chandra, Samya, Simone, Delane, Imani, for Amma, for Claudia, for Catherine, for Sarah, for Angela, for Bidisha, for Naya, for Anne, for Akta, for Karen, and for those who have left us, for Gloria, for Bessie, for Papuza, for Charlotte, for my grandmother Abba Dinah Kwansma Edwin Badin, who died a year ago singing praises to the Lord after 102 years of living. For my friend and sister Khadija Say, her mother Mary Mendy, and for all those missing and devastated by the hideous crime, massacre that we know as the Grenfell Tower fire. I walked barefoot at the opening of the Diaspora Pavilion with a basket full of candles with these handwritten words from Angela Davis. Freedom is a constant struggle. The palazzo filled with those privileged to make the opening week of the Venice Biennale, and us artists with our sister Khadija. We declared independence not as nation, we declared autonomy over our bodies, our words, our histories, our traces elevated to objects of ritual remembering, an archaeology of black memory, Sankofa. I speak in the tongues of my mother and my grandmother and our grandmothers before her. Although I do not know the words, the very being is in the evidence of those languages. It is in these words I will speak. It is in these words that I will create. It is in these words that I will question. I question this place, this diaspora place, as an ideal narrative of my relationship to my internal migratory roots. The distances between become more apparent as we get to second, third, and fourth generations removed from motherlands. How do I map myself in this place? My family, the people that left and arrived and continue to arrive, even though they make borders, make checkpoints, and build walls. The process of making is enacting my presence, the hard navigation of presences, absences, visibility, invisibility, navigating, finding roots, arranging traces of memory from archives that will never be constituted, entering spaces without invitation, or spaces that have antagonistic or conditional invitations, time-limited invitations, invitations by special arrangement. Presence as performance, a kind of sociability that explains a connection but keeps you outside, always arriving. The need becomes urgent, utterances become words, sounds, whispers, shouts. The need to collect, assemble, activate the stories, the narratives, undo the knowledges, the what is known, to make something visible. Love and rage exist within me simultaneously.
Yes, he does. And if somebody loved me.
15 moments in my life when I couldn't avoid the political awakenings. Being born a black girl in the UK. Going to school and being taught in a curriculum that did not include me. The National Front campaigning outside of my primary school. Watching Steve Biko's funeral on Wild in Action with my dad. My dad crying because his mother died in Ghana and he did not have the money to go home and bury her. Going to the Notting Hill Carnival at 7 years old and seeing many black people join us in the streets. Riots in Brixton around the UK in 1981. My brother being stopped by the police in 1985. My brother taken to the streets in Brixton in 1985. Being chased out of school by racist boys who targeted black and brown girls. Realising that the bus stop that Stephen Lawrence got killed at was the same one that my sister and I stood at to get our bus home from school. Art college on my foundation course when I was told my work was not African enough and was put on probation that has never ended. When I became a mother to a girl child and started reading black feminist writing, witnessing a number of diversity initiatives, diversity projects, diversity policies. It's tiring. The personal is political. Oops. Go to the back. the opening of Latamani and Nicholas Grandi's film, The Poetics of Fragility, Angela Davis says, "A strong woman is sometimes strongly fed up." A walk, start point, all records. A walk to water, a connection with sea, the distances created. I make an invitation to our ancestors to walk with us in the streets of Zurich. Grandmothers, grandfathers, uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers, sisters, intellectual ancestors, ancestors known and unknown, a desire to get to know them. On our way, we do our collective tarot reading using my Black Power tarot cards. We walk to Helvetia and reread Baldwin's text written in Birmingham. And that stops you. That stops you from going any further. At some point in the world's history, I became Powell's nigger. That's how I got my name. Barbara means stranger, foreign or strange, from the Greek barbarous, traveller from a foreign land. A card is picked, L'Emperor. Place me at your centre like an inexhaustible spring as the root of your future soaring flight. We walk again. Who is Powell? Enoch Powell. He made the infamous Rivers of Blood Street speech in 1968. Why do we evoke our ancestors? How far back do we go? Suppose we don't want to walk with them. Suppose I find out my ancestor was a colonizer, a slave trader. I don't want to know that. Over the bridge, we stop at the stock exchange. We listen to Lord Kitchener, the birth of Ghana, independence, hope, excitement, a belief in the possibility of self-determination, a meeting, a romance, a coup, a departure, migration, an arrival, a family, a rejection, antagonism, a desire to belong. Children, please do better than we did. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Second card, Lamat. Do not be afraid of freeing the instinct, no matter how primitive. We walk again. We stand on the streets above the gold and talk about how Credit Suisse came into being, to bankroll the railway in Switzerland. Alfred Escher, its founder, the spiritual father of the railway law of 1852, defeated the idea of a state-run railway in favour of privatisation. The chief exec of Credit Suisse, I am told, is a black man, blacker than me. Tidjane Thiam. He is from Ivory Coast. I am also told he is not liked much. Le Papesse. In union with the power that I perceive everything, my weakness and doubts evaporate. As we walk, we see iron men running. Le Judgment. I come from an inconceivable golden egg in which being and non-being are indifferentiated light. Saint Barbara, the great martyr, is the protectress against fire and lightning. She is the patron saint of those who work with explosives. We end our walk by eating ice cream and talking about Swiss feminism and labour movements.
Her name is Monica Amakifia, which means Kingmaker, a very appropriate name for a beauty queen. Her official title is Miss Ghana, and she's arriving at London Airport for a 12-day visit to Britain. And who better to show Monica the sights of London than Miss Great Britain, Iris Warner. In her own country, Miss Ghana is a seamstress, so naturally she would like to visit one of London's fashion houses. Preferably fashions which she doesn't get a chance to look at in Africa, like this 1,000-pound mink bolero shown by expert Mr. Deanfield. A little warm for the tropics, but it feels good in London. And now for a call at Asprey's, where diamonds sparkle all the world over. And when jewelers display their wares so invitingly, they know what they're doing. Miss Ghana decides she likes London indoors or out, and London's glad to welcome a very charming representative of a brand new country.
As always, a painful declaration of independence. For Amma.
for me. The problem, dear friend, dear comrade, is not that I am a woman and you are a man, or at least not only that, or that you come from a different quarter of the village, the town, the district, the region, the country, the continent, the earth. The problem was never that I am black and you are white, or not only that. And as much as I wish I had 2 whole legs, like you, plus a half, and given my life, I could have even done with an extra arm. A 3rd eye that saw not just into me, but you and others and things. I could have loaned you a little fat too, to help you through those cold mornings at Hamatan and the even more colder nights of your winter. Friend, height was not missed much, except when I needed to reach the upper shelves of my existence, from where I would want, occasionally, to bring down my forgotten hopes, aspirations, plans, and projects to be dusted. When I would wish fondly that I had one such as you around, with the longer arm that could elegantly reach for the tree tops to pick the ripest and most succulent successes from the skies. Oh, my dear brother, the decision to sever and separate was not based on the knowledge of me as a forever dreamer, unable and incapable of handling the clear world of take and take and take, while you could comprehend the motions of survival and move with the speed of a hare in a burning grassland. I'm cutting loose, my dear, for only one reason. I do not know where else you go, whom else you meet when we part. I've had to learn that these other associations live. The connections are there and tight. The commitments are real. The allegiances binding, and the reverberations from them have a way of coming at me, shaking my foundations, affecting me negatively. I have nightmares of different gatherings after we had parted, where too you sit at centre stage, where they call up names to censure, characters to assassinate, plot our undoings. And you do not say anything. You do not own up to knowing me well, or our comradeship, and what I thought was our mutual understanding. So, my dear, my love, I am gone. I am through. I cannot show up for the meeting tonight, or any other night, anywhere, ever again. No, my dear, my friend, I cannot show up tonight. I won't be there. I am gone. I'm going to end with this quote from Fred Moten and Stefano Hani. In the clear critical light of day, illusionary administrators whisper of our need for institutions, and all institutions are political, and all politics is correctional. So it seems we need correctional institutions in the common, settling it, correcting us.
but we won't stand corrected. Moreover, incorrect as we are, there is nothing wrong with us. We do not want to be correct, and we won't be corrected. Politics proposes to make us better, but we are already good in the mutual debt that can never be made good. We owe it to each other to falsify the institution, to make politics incorrect, to give the lie our own determination. We owe each other the indeterminate. We owe each other everything.
Wow. Kind of love and rage and possibilities.
Whoops. Shall we,
Thank you, Barbie. Thank you, Alistair.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I have to load up. Just digest all that for a little moment as well. I think it needs it.
Amanda's quiet.
Oh yeah. So basically, I'm going to talk about Mima. I've probably got too many slides for the time, so I might skip some bits. Might be, we'll just play it by ear. But essentially, I'm going to give this context, maybe talk about what I see as the role of making and doing in as a way of kind of working between the cracks in a polarized society and coming up with solutions or ways of working that take us in a different trajectory. This is Margaret Thatcher and her visit to Teesside in 1987. We did a show about Margaret Thatcher recently, just closed, and it's famously called The Walk in the Wilderness. And it's her walking across the rubble of the broken steelworks. This is Mima, built 10 years ago as a classic regeneration project in the Guggenheim Bilbao mold, like every city should have one. That was the glamour photo. This is the kind of the shitty current version with dog poo and algae on the walls and everything else. This is where it sits in the civic square at the centre of the town, a robust institution alongside the town hall and the law courts and the library and everything else. You zoom out further, this is the Tees Valley, a post-industrial region created in the early 19th century. Previously a farm of 40 people, then they discovered coal and iron ore, and the rest is history, kind of gold rush. This is the steelworks that closed down 18 months ago for good. What was the second largest steelworks in Europe, gone forever. There it is in kind of full flight. And obviously, these circumstances creating this situation. This is what I use to describe where Middlesbrough is geographically and politically. So northeast corner of Britain. Red is basically Brexit. Blue is Remain. This is the northeast. The darkest spot there is Thornaby, a ward in Middlesbrough with the highest percentage of Brexit voting, 82%. Also, this has led to Middlesbrough being kind of variously described, rather sort of, deliciously by certain people as the Detroit of Britain. And this is kind of what it looks like as well. And certainly in some parts, this is Gresham, an area I'm going to talk about later, which is an area earmarked for housing market renewal, but also an area which has become home to refugees and asylum seekers in a very acute sense. Britain has the highest per capita ratio of asylum seekers and refugees in the UK, partly due to the privatisation of the migratory control system, which led to this kind of national scandal of it being revealed that all these kind of new residents were being housed behind red doors and therefore being targeted by certain right-wing extremists. I'm going to kind of skip a little bit through the art history bit, but essentially this gentleman, a friend of ours, is in a way, he's at the other end of the parabolic arc of modernity, at which this figure sits at the beginning. It's nice to use the slide of the Goethe Institute as well. But basically, this is the model of art as we know it. This is the software engineer behind it. This is Immanuel Kant, who's basically, this is the proposition of autonomy of art. And I think this is something, in terms of instrumentalization of art, something we can talk about later on perhaps. But what I've been interested in doing is kind of reclaiming suppressed histories within art, which these histories have pushed down. And one of those figures in opposition to all that is John Ruskin, perhaps the world's first aesthetic social activist, we maybe describe him as. Or things like this, which is the Mechanics Institute movement, which was in Anglophone countries beginning from 1800 onwards, which were basically bringing art and science to the working classes as a kind of bettering process, as a kind of instrumentalization of the workforce, slightly philanthropic, slightly instrumental, but interestingly at the same time, the birthplace for a lot of counter-movements, such as the really useful knowledge movement, or unionization or feminist activism. This, in a way, this kind of interest has coalesced into a kind of body of activity that I've been involved in for some time now, which is basically kind of people around the world who are interested in this idea of reinstigating use value into the role of art. And I know it's commented before that this is maybe problematic, but nonetheless, I think this is kind of a job that needs to be done, maybe needs to evolve, but nonetheless, for me, it's become central to all this work. One of the big initiating projects was the Museum of Art Utile, that we worked on at the Van Abbe Museum about 3 years ago, alongside which we created the Association d'Art et Utile, the Association of Art as a Tool, if you like. This is the kind of the committee, I suppose, Tanya, Charles Escher, Nick King, Zani Fletcher, etc. And basically part of that was this culmination of an archive of over 300 case studies of this idea, examples of art working in society for social effect. And this has led to a constellation of activity all around the world that's ongoing. Recently, this is the Escuela de Arte Utile at Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco, which was a kind of school to kind of see if we could teach these methodologies of activism or kind of re-institutionalizing the institution. And also culminated in the conference, the Arte Utile, this year's Arte Utile Summit at SF MoMA, which in a way was kind of like this moment where you start to feel like these ideas start to hit the mainstream. When SF MoMA kind of starting to take these things on board, even if it's badly, nonetheless, this is kind of a key moment in terms of 10 years ago, this stuff was laughed at. Other ways of kind of instigating these ideas, I mean, an example in the UK is this project by Assemble, which is the Granby 4 Streets project. It was actually a project by the community in which Assemble were invited. It's not really a project by Assemble, that's really important to say. But basically a ground-up reclamation of, again, an area marked for housing market renewal that basically used the artists as part of a continuum, as part of a body of activity, rather than an art project per se, and that's something that I think is quite important. Obviously winning the Turner Prize, which again was sort of a slightly mischievous moment, I suppose, in terms of breaking this kind of thinking through. Underpinning all this is a body of work which includes Stephen Wright's Lexicon of Usership, which was a book to accompany the Museum of Art Utile, but is really kind of like a guidebook, a handbook. It's available as a free PDF download on the Art Utile website, even though it's gone out of print now. But it introduces certain terms to be phased out, some to be brought in, around this idea of usership, and one of which is the Museum 3.0, in which really, when I moved to MIMA 3 years ago, was really kind of, the software for how we might start to reshape an institution which previously had been under attack. So you have to understand that MIMA is kind of, my previous kind of incumbent director described MIMA as, working on the front line. She said it's a frontier town. If you can make art work here, you can make it work anywhere. And in fact, as I entered the post, there was a mayor running for a candidate running for mayor on an anti-MIMA ticket who was going to close it down because it was elitist. It was basically a kind of backdoor colonialism, bringing London international art to the unwashed masses of Middlesbrough, which is kind of true. Anyway, so the Museum 3.0 is really kind of the user-generated model of the institution. So if this is beyond participation, which I disagree with quite a lot, because you're participating still in this prescribed agenda set by someone else or by a particular group of people. So what we began to do was to kind of create the program of the institution which responded to current urgencies, which worked for our constituents. One of the first shots across the bows was this project called Localism, which was an exhibition I built as the antidote to the international blockbuster, which was essentially a crowdsourced history of art in Middlesbrough from 1830 to the present day, in which people brought things along, contributed. It was collectively assembled including things like these, another social project in the 1880s called Linthorpe Pottery, which was involved Christopher Dresser using the clay from the ground in Middlesbrough to turn into wares that could be sold on the international market as a sort of social enterprise, which we have kind of reanimated, or two local artists have reanimated with new Linthorpe using the same clay, but making new wares, but also interestingly, and this is in the show, using the show as a vehicle to teach people how to use pottery, but not for its own sake, but coming together to meet, to make, and then to discuss the issues of the day and what we might do about them. Similarly, another amazing project. These are kind of, you could do a whole day on this sort of stuff. This is the Bousbecq settlement in Middlesbrough, which is a kind of quasi-communist, tough kind of Nazi work camp in the 1930s, which was using German miners to teach unemployed Middlesbrough miners in kind of new skills, including Wilfrid Frank being brought from the Bauhaus to teach furniture design, and Michael Tippett on the right teaching music to the miners. This is the original furniture which was sold in Peter Jones. And then we restarted with Adam Clark, a local artist, New Bousbecq, which is kind of the same idea, teaching young unemployed people or unemployed residents how to design and make using new technology, so CNC machines, CAD design, etc., etc. So this furniture is now refurbishing the building of the museum, but is also available for sale, and it now turns over £60,000 a year in terms of generating a kind of social enterprise model. In terms of kind of on the macro scale, before many years ago, sort of early noughties, I worked with Liam Gillick on the design of the new Home Office building in London. And part of that was a proposal for a text that was going to be on the front of the building, which was deemed as too pretentious by the MPs and ministers in the Home Office, would never actually materialised on the building. But I always thought it'd be a nice title for a show at some point, at some time in the future. So when we wanted to address the urgency of the refugee crisis, this seemed to be an apt title within the show. And this was really basically to make a project that actually made something happen and made a difference. So not to think of it as a project, as a standalone, but the beginning of a whole body of work which would be a focus for the institution amongst many other things. So this included making films. This is a film with our kind of constituents, with Isabel Lima, who's here. She can talk about these projects at lunchtime maybe. And then basically creating an exhibition which was about the migratory condition, but also acted as a resource platform for these communities to use the museum, or kind of misuse the museum, as a place in which these things might be begin to have actual traction in the world. So this is basically not using the galleries as a space of spectatorship, but using the gallery as a site of operation. And that includes kind of free food, computer access, conferences, talks, meetings. This is the Arte Chill Summit in Gagara at the year before in Middlesbrough within the exhibition. But then this also feeds into other programs as well. So the exhibition grows and spills out into this group now working in our garden to cultivate a growing space in the garden, which again is about coming and making and doing together and advocating for themselves, which feeds into our cafe and our food offer. So we now have, every Thursday we have a community meal for between 80 and 100 groups, a free meal for anybody who wants to come along within Lima in the atrium, and becomes, in effect, a core part of our program. And this is a major switch. So basically our public programs are now the principle of what we do. That's the front face. Exhibitions and collections service that agenda. So it's a complete reversal of the normal polarity of an institution. And then we have kind of the Office of Art, Useful Art within the institution, kind of joining our administration office, which is a place of making and planning, where people come together to use the space to kind of congregate and to come up with solutions and ideas for what we might actually do in the town. This example is a workshop, again with Linthorpe Pottery and with kind of groups from the Eritrean community who basically couldn't get their Eritrean coffee service. That's one of their big problems, that they couldn't find this in the shops. So we've designed and made coffee service, which they could then be used. But the point being, this is not just about doing a craft project that everybody came together around, but was in fact this place where we could start to plan and have these conversations about, well, what do we do next? So this is not about projectitis. This is about the wider endeavour. which leads into projects. This is Daniela Ortiz working with, again on the right is Bini Araya, who kind of leads basically a charity that advocates for the new communities in Middlesbrough. And Daniela worked with single mothers to address, well, we did a show called The ABC of Racist Europe with her. And this was, again, a platform to advocate their story. And in part of it, they remade this book from 1899, which, as you can read, is pretty spectacular in terms of its social programming. This is a children's book, which they then remade according to their terms and their understanding of how the world works. Interestingly, the show got raided by the police at one point. They had a complaint that we were being racist to white people, which I kind of thought, well, I did say something, is that possible? But they seemed to think it was. But nonetheless, what was quite interesting was the chief of police then said, actually, this is really good. We should work with you all the time, rather than closing us down. We wanted to address the industry, because it's also important that you don't become a kind of echo chamber of leftist, people hugging. We have to also address the wider context as well. So in terms of the communities who, the kind of older, more established communities who in Middlesbrough have lost their industry and their reason for being, we presented a show which was about that history, but also was looking forward. So this is on the left, a group of redundant steelworkers planning the future of the site and what might happen next. And that in itself has led to a big planning advocacy project in terms of city government of what we do with the future of the steelworks. Even collections, we've lent this kind of crowdsourcing moment. So this is the 3.0 model of basically hanging the collections according to selections by the public, or the publics, as they used to be known. We kind of call them constituents or users now, but that's open to debate. And one great example is this Sonia Boyce. It's been in the collection for 30 years, but never been shown in MENA. There's even the letter in the archive of the curator saying it doesn't think it's really relevant to the communities around Middlesbrough. But was chosen by this good friend of ours, Osama. This was his kind of label for the work, as he completely identified with it. And this is this complete change in perception and function of how we think about the collections operating. Very sadly, Osama, who was an amazing guy, and someone we were just talking before about skills, before he used to be an interior designer for Saddam Hussein's palaces, but ended up in Middlesbrough having gone through an awful experience of torture and persecution. And sadly, Osama took his own life about a year ago. But nonetheless, we then made an exhibition of his works, which is now touring the UK with the Methodist Asylum Project, which is kind of still trying to advocate for a better understanding of these conditions. Another project that evolved out of all this work, I mean, this is a narrow band of activity, but we've been looking at the housing conditions in that Gresham area that I showed. What can we do? What can we change? How can we take control from a ground-up way of this area? And again, working with Isabel, she proposed basically with this group from of local residents to build a Trojan horse. Here we go, here's it being made, 5-metre high horse, which was built at Nima and then paraded down the street and located in Gresham Park, basically as a kind of instigation of a new form of regeneration from this area that didn't come from the top, but came from the needs and concerns of the community. And this is kind of ongoing. This is only a couple of weeks ago. This is the horse at the local settlement building. But interestingly, the point is, this is not just a kind of symbolic gesture. I mean, it does operate in that way, but also by learning the skills of carpentry, etc. This group basically now trained up to start refurbishing some of the houses on their own terms, including we're in negotiating at the moment for asset transfer of 3 properties to this group so that they can run these as community buildings, as accommodation, as maybe a refugee-run hotel, which would be very nice if we could make that happen. And this also then expands into our role as an institution in developing and changing the housing situation within Middlesbrough. This is part of our current exhibition that's on now, called the Idea Home Show, which is again is an exhibition functioning in part of a wider regime of change with the institution. This is kind of like the left-wing political campaign room about alternative strategies to housing. So an example is Nuremberg Trial's project from Madrid, where I don't know this project, but there was a housing block that nobody could, it was empty, but no one could live in it. So they found a loophole in the law that if you take all the doors off the building, you can then occupy it. And this now is then evolving even further into housing itself. So what we're looking at in Gresham is with a group that Isabel's involved in, with Binny, the community, the residents, the TV architect George Clark, weirdly, the university, local NGOs, is to basically create new models of housing. Actually to start basically getting our foot in the door in influencing and changing and actually building the landscape around us so that it works for our constituents. And then I think it's 20 minutes up, but I'll just touch on this, which is kind of, it's related in a way. This is a rebranding exercise. So I was very keen to rebrand MIMA, but thought it should follow this logic. Like everything should be a project in the institution, including the shop or the cafe. So basically, in the space that's normally designed for huge Louis Bourgeois sculptures in the old-fashioned sense, we dedicated this space to sort of, again, a kind of crowdsourced, open source creation of an identity for MIMA, working with the designers Kellenberg and White with this sort of robot print machine where people could kind of, express themselves, make their own systems of communication, which would then formulate into our brand and our logo type and the kind of language on the building, the vinyl, but more importantly in terms of the way in which we communicate people and the language in which we talk to our users and to the wider world. And you can't see that slide, it's too thin. But it says Middlesbrough Institute of Mild-Mannered Activism. But essentially, this is the kind of transformation that we're proposing needs to take place through these processes. So in question of this, this idea of art, I mean, I have a very broad understanding of art as basically human activity. That's my sort of bottom line. But it is through these processes that we actually start to come up, through this making and doing rather than necessarily orating, that we actually create these listening devices for action that actually starts to have real change in the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, one of the things, one of the questions I think about this work, to bring it to a kind of practical level, is how to sustain work. I think we're notorious in the arts for coming in and doing a show about gender and then moving on to a single show about an artist and so on. And you've created this this work which now has a huge responsibility perhaps to be sustained in some sort of way, and you're about to leave to go to Manchester and to maybe to take some of it with you. But I'm curious now as what's going to that you had a baton handed to you, to what degree you can hand one on to somebody else, or whether it's free to whoever takes that your role, maybe you could turn it in another direction.
Yeah, well actually I was writing a job description on the plane on the way here, but we're making it very tight. So basically all the stakeholders want it to continue. Basically the council, the Arts Council and the university, and the community say, no, it needs to stay doing what it's doing. So we're basically prescribing that. Because the last thing the place needs is another vision, and that's not what's wanted, and that's important as well. That this is actually a good testament to the way that this thing has been created collectively rather than by a singular individual. So therefore, this institution should not be dictated to by a singular individual anymore. And in fact, in a way, the program is shaped by the urgencies. So when I started, I said, okay, what are the big problems? Migration. It's housing, it's attainment of children under 5, it's domestic violence, etc., etc. Okay, well that's the job. And then how do we apply kind of artistic thinking processes or non-art thinking or non-art thinking processes in this endeavour? So really that structure is set up, although, yeah, it was hard. I mean, interestingly, Binny, when I announced I was leaving, and we talked about, looking at people eye to eye, these are our friends. Right? I see Binny nearly every day. And he said that you were our conduit, the top. You were our route, and that's what they saw. In terms of structures of power,
it was very interesting to see how an institution could be misused in order to get access to power, particularly for some of these groups. But as I said to him, that still exists, that's still there, but it's not an individual that's doing that, it's this collectivized approach.
And Barbie, I don't know whether I can frame this question right in a way, but you've done some work with Lima with Tech and Platform. Presumably you were invited by Alistair to come and do something?
I haven't actually started to do any work with Lima. I've worked with Tech and Platform for some time in various different guises. I don't know what to say from there. I mean, that's institutional, that's not what I was kind of presenting. You know, in a way, I think what I wanted to present was something that was really about the different way in which I have to navigate working with institutions, and I think that that's really, or working generally, you know, working with different conditions, and kind of, you know, particularly this year, just like really working with death and loss, and, you know, something that lives not just in a kind of art space, but lives in a kind of, you know, so the best way to think about it with the Moten and Harney quote at the end is lives in black social life. And what I think I wanted to bring to this, because, you know, I'm very fortunate to be an artist, I'm very fortunate to be invited by Platform, but what is it that I want to bring into that space, and what are the conversations that I want to have, and those conversations, you know, I completely put in there that the personal, I can't escape that. I can't escape the personal and political. You know, as much as you kind of you can go over, like the first bit that I presented, you can go over the water to Venice and celebrate, you know, diversity and diaspora in the UK, and, you know, the artists want to have a very vigorous conversation within that, and the only way that we can have it in the end is because one of our colleagues dies in the Grenfell Tower fire, and that still is a very difficult space in which to have a very rigorous discussion about what we're contending with. Right, so yeah, I mean, yes, I've worked with these institutions, but I think that I'm trying to think about, you know, developing a practice more than that. That's what I bring in.
Sure. Any questions or comments from all of you? Marcel?
I would have a question that I'd like to pose to both of you. You mentioned the problem of echo chambers, which I find really concrete in your example, as you're working in an area where there's pro-Brexit, for instance, or probably racist, sexist, whatever, thinking people. And I just realized in my own practice, I find it on the one hand hard to understand when I am in echo chamber. I think it's quite tricky to realize it. And on the other hand, I also realized that my willingness to talk to people whom I find dangerous or whom I find despicable is rather limited. And I just wonder if you have experiences with these complex of questions or challenges. Probably.
Do you want me to answer first?
Both of you. Yeah.
Well, I'll answer because I'm ready. Probably on a weekly, daily basis. You know, there's no, when you're a kind of a population of 6% in the UK, and then when you travel, because for example, in that second piece that I wrote that was published, you know, you travel to Switzerland and you're kind of walking around and you're invited to be present in the space, and then you have people that sort of ask you questions that you can't even consider, not to consider. You know, when someone says, "Oh, the director of Credit Suisse is a black man, blacker than you," and then says, "And he's a not very good man. He's a bad man." You kind of have to figure out ways to respond. Say on a daily basis, I'm not in an echo chamber.
my echo chamber is I suppose what is described in kind of black feminist and queer circles now is a safe space, and those safe spaces are the spaces where you can speak, but they're needed because on a daily basis you're not kind of dealing with that. Now I think someone mentioned something earlier. It was like there's moments where you have kind of just people just coming out with stuff because they don't know, right? They don't, and you just have to respond to that. So actually, Michaela and I had a conversation about, talking to your neighbour who is, who voted for Brexit.
Yeah, I said, just to say, so I said to Barbie, I've got this next door neighbour, and sort of best friends, and the three of them in the house voted Remain, so that's fine. And one of them, I think, shocked the other three people in the house but voted Brexit. And I was saying to Barbie, so I've kind of just staying off the subject, and you said you definitely can't, you shouldn't do that. You can't stay off the subject.
You have to be, and I think this is what's kind of clear, you have to be really present in the conversation, I think more so now than ever. I mean, this is where we have to understand what allyship is and solidarity, and that's why I wanted to also end with that quote from Stefano Hani and Fred Moten, because we owe each other everything. This condition that we're living in this world, climate change, racism, sexism, kind of poverty, we're complicit in all of it. So we do need to kind of think about how we stand. So yeah, I don't have.
Can someone think to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the only way, if we're talking about, for me, it's about what can we do to make things better. It sounds rather kind of glib, but that's generally the plan. Because it's somewhere you live, it's somewhere where your children grow up. That's your environment. These are your, the people around you. So it is about what making things in a way that's less bad. Because you see so many problems, and everybody sees the problems. Some people express it through Brexit, and you can see exactly why. I can see exactly why it happened. I don't necessarily agree with it, and in my own conscience, you do what your brain constructs, and I have a certain position on it, which is not that. And I was very, as an institution, I was very vocal in actually in the referendum. I was very. Catherine Bones here, we were having, kind of sour Brexit cocktail parties and, and all this sort of stuff in Lima. And I was I was alone, and we had the Newsnight truck outside with Kirsty Walker. There was me and a nurse who were kind of pro-Remain, and about 20 other people who were totally, totally Brexit. But, I kind of get it. But the only way for me to resolve it is to work through it and start to do things together with people, because it's so polarized.
And you actually achieve to do things together.
It's beginning to happen, because we're also working. What I didn't show you, we're also beginning work in this area called North Ormsby, which is the area that historically would be described as the disenfranchised white working class. It's all the terraced houses where people used to work in the steelworks, and now it's just as bad as those areas there. They have no cars on the streets because no one can afford a car. They're empty. It's really huge problems. Rings all the bells in terms of urban deprivation in the UK. But then just going and listening and talking to the group we're working with, which is really fascinating, because people aren't, of course, they don't fulfil the picture that's constructed of kind of Brexit voters. They all have worries and concerns, and they think they're doing the right thing. But interestingly, they were talking about the Catholic Church within that part of town. And the resentment, basically they felt ostracized by the church, because the church was doing all this stuff with refugees and asylum seekers, because it got funding and it got grants and it got, the imperatives and the kind of energies were there to service those agendas. But they were saying, but they never ask us, they never, we don't get, they felt very left out. And it wasn't because they were, they were being racist, or they were kind of coming from that place. But it's because that they could see the problem as well from their perspective. But they also have, interestingly, they have a willingness to change things as well. They do have an openness. And in a way, it's kind of doing these projects, doing these things, which way, maybe it's almost like distraction therapy, but I do believe in actually just doing something physical and getting on in the world and doing it. When people see people working, I think that's one of the best kind of forms of human communication, and it's worked in lots after years and years of doing social practice, whatever you want to call it. I've always found that people seeing other people working is an amazing kind of communication tool, even when there's no language. So I think that then starts to pay off when you can see that sort of building, constructing taking place, and these networks building.
A question at the back.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that, your thoughts very much. I had a question around, Michaela, you were talking a little bit about how do you sustain these sorts of thoughts and initiatives, and I was wondering from a kind of institutional perspective, you know, there's different layerings. You know, Alistair, when you were talking about the idea of the museum as project, about the sense that these are sort of areas of investigation in terms of your programs, but I was thinking about how that then impacts on the structures of an institution. So, you know, the built environment, or the cultures within it, or the way that you staff it. And I was just wondering if you had some examples where you thought institutions were really grappling in interesting ways with some of these challenges. I mean, obviously MIMA is a really great example of that, but I was wondering if there were others that you felt that obviously they may not be coming to, you know, an end point with it, but where actually the structural implications of some of this were being interrogated interestingly.
I think everybody's trying to work it out at the moment, I'd say. No one's really come up with, you know, I mean, they're not solutions really, but ways of working. I think one of the problem with art institutions is that they're staffed by art people. And actually what art institutions, I mean, I found it at MIMA, I think what we really need, I need a psychologist, I need, you know, a pastoral worker, I need maybe a lawyer, I think maybe I need a gardener. You know, there are kinds of these other things that would be really useful people to have around and actually to work in creative ways, and I think that's, in a way, I'm kind of more interested in how can we actually get the other institutions in society, like the mayor's office or the law courts or the school, to actually operate it in kind of sort of artistic or semi-artistic ways. How do, you know, this is this question of art, right? It's not, I really kind of have to fight against this idea of art or not art. You know, it's this spectrum of activity and a question of degree. So how can we infuse all our structures in society with this degree of art, and equally how can we dissolve those back into the institution? But I don't know, examples, right? I mean, I was just in Stockholm the past 2 days, and obviously went to Tensta Konsala yesterday, who are kind of doing similar things. But then also interestingly, I was doing some work with ArcDes, which is the sort of architecture museum next door to Moderna Museum. And they're tackling this problem now of their actually future as an institution, because they're on an island and they have no constituency. So what's their role within the city? Salt in Istanbul, I think, is in terms of finding a place for itself within an urban fabric and people using it, is kind of an interesting place. I mean, there are quite a few, but does that help?
Can I pick up on something? Because I also do a lot of, I have a kind of consultancy that I work with another curator called Curators, and you know, one of the things you brought up was staffing, Darren. And I mean, who's in it? You said full of artists, but there's also, you know, what kind and who are these people and where do they come from, and where's the point that there's just the refugee or the, you know, that person or this other people. And I think one of the things that is really key, I think, in the next kind of time for institutions is to actually really ask questions about these constituents, as you call them, because, you know, often we're going into spaces, you know, big organisations that claim to be doing sort of social practice work, and you know, they're kind of going in and working with particular communities, and then there's no one to represent these communities. And that is really, really significant. But we've got third and fourth generation people who, you know, are here and present or in these countries that are ready to do these jobs. So we have to start thinking about how you're always people are always being employed in the same image. So we're still then repeating the same kind of colonial tropes of, you know, what do you call it, of philanthropy or, you know, charity. So we need to really think about that too. How does that then develop?
Right, I think we'll draw this morning to a close and meet back again here at 2 o'clock. And meanwhile, a big thank you to you, Barbie, and to you, Alistair.